Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Julian Brave Noisecat. Julian is a writer, Oscar-nominated filmmaker, and champion powwow dancer. His first documentary, Sugarcane, follows an investigation into abuse and missing children at the Indian residential school that Noisecat's family was sent to near Williams Lake, British Columbia. It won dozens of awards and was nominated for an Academy Award and a Peabody Award. His first book, We Survived the Night, was released on October 14th. Julian, thanks so much for joining us this week.
Gonna wait. Good to be here. Always love to be on APTN. Great to have you. Or great to be in conversation, excuse me.
Well, it's a real pleasure for us here as well. Let's start with your book. It's just recently been released, We Survived the Night, an Indigenous Reckoning. Can you start us off by telling us a bit about the book?
Sure. So We Survived the Night is a story about Indigenous peoples in Canada and the United States. And it starts as a personal story and expands outward from there into a really continental story. But what is, I would say, literarily different and maybe ambitious about it is that it's told in the style, structure, and tradition of a coyote story, which is, I'm sure APTN viewers are familiar, but, coyote story is a traditional trickster narrative from my own people's culture. It's a story about how the world was created and why things are the way they are. And so through the stories of the trickster and the ideas running through those stories, I write about myself, about my dad, about my grandfather, and about the broader Indian world, and about how this tradition that was nearly wiped off the face of the earth by colonization still actually gets at a lot of the truth of our stories as First Peoples. And, arguably looking out at the world right now, maybe at the truth more broadly than that.
Right. Going to circle back around to that coyote story part there, but the excerpt on the Penguin Random House site under the heading In the Beginning, harrowing story about Tony, the night watchman at St. Joseph's Mission Residential School in British Columbia, and what he discovers. This is kind of part of what's in Sugarcane, but can you tell us about that In the Beginning excerpt?
So this is a really painful and hard story that I it took a long time for me to be able to come around to tell it. It's the story of my father's birth at St. Joseph's Mission, the Indian residential school that my family was sent to near Williams Lake. It's a story that I actually didn't know until I set out to make Sugarcane and to write We Survived the Night. It's not a story that my own father knew. And so I felt some responsibility to learn it so that we could know our sort of shared origin story, where we came from, what our beginning was. I don't want to give away too much because I hope people go and read it, but essentially it's a story of how my father was born at St. Joseph's Mission and found in the trash incinerator, at the precipice of birth and death, really, and how he survived and how we came to be here today.
Well, yeah, let's talk about that a bit. The book, like you mentioned, it's laid out in days and told in the style of a coyote story. There's Coyote and his son, Coyote steals the salmon, and Coyote comes back. Can you tell us about the significance of that?
So those three parts of the book are actually three of the greatest hits, I would say, from the epic misadventures of the trickster, at least as my people have told them. Coyote and his son is about how Coyote at one point in time was a lonely bachelor, and so he decided to try to make himself a son so that he wouldn't be so lonely anymore. And he tries and he fails and eventually succeeds, only to get envious of his own kid and to abandon him. And in the story of a lonely bachelor who ends up far from home making a kid and going on some epic misadventures with him, I saw a lot of my own father and my own family story. In the story of a guy who, at the beginning of time, this is the Coyote steals a salmon, finds himself stuck in a fish trap operated by these two witches who decides to steal those salmon and to give them to the people, but in so doing, to then use the salmon as an opportunity to marry into as many, indigenous communities along the river as he could. I see a bit of my own my own grandfather, a guy who I would say helped bring our people back from a genocide, played a disproportionate role in bringing our people back from a genocide, and had, I could name 19 kids, So the point is that the trickster and the stories about him, these aren't just fairy tales, these aren't just fables. They actually are stories about someone who we understood to be our ancestors, someone who we understood to be within us in a sense, and also to be shaping the transformations of the world as we saw it. And as I was, reading, because I really had to read these old trickster stories because my family and nobody I know really tells them anymore. I saw so much of my family and the Indian world. And I just wanted to bring that back to life on the page and to insist really that these traditions, these stories, these narrative ideas that have been, forgotten, including by our own people sometimes, actually really get at the truth of the way things are, and they deserve to be grappled with by literature and the humanities and what have you.
Really love that. We talked about how the book opens with the story of survival, literal survival of your father, but there's a different meaning behind the title of the book, right?
Exactly, yeah. So, We Survived the Night is actually derived from the traditional Secwepemchin way to say good morning, which is Chuchwinuk, which doesn't actually literally mean good morning. It means you survived the night. And when I was in college, I had the opportunity to spend my summers on the res and to learn Secwepemchin from my kia, my grandmother, who's still with us. And I remember she had a mug, a coffee mug, that she'd make her tea in before we started our Secwepemchin lessons. And it said Chuchwinuk on there. And that's how I learned what Chuchwinuk was and what it meant. And I was always struck by the significance, the depth of meaning that our language held. What did it mean when our ancestors greeted each other in the day, after the smallpox epidemic took north of 60% of our people, sometimes 90%, depending on the historian you're asking. And we found entire pit houses full of departed. What did it mean to say Chochwinuk to each other, in the morning after the children were taken away to the residential school? And also, what a kind of dark humor to use, to have my kia who's teaching me the language, have that on her coffee mug, in a language that unfortunately now only has 2 remaining fluent speakers on our reserve. I think that there's so much of the tragicomic sensibility that I see in our people in that word. And so it was the germ of an idea, Chochwinuk, we survived the night, to start with the ideas embedded within our own languages and to try to start telling a story from there and to expand outward. And that's how I eventually, arrived at the coyote stories as well. And it has deeply shaped my work, and I hope it continues to shape my work for the rest of the time that they let me do it.
Right. Yeah, when I read about the title, I was like, wow, I really love that. You've, Julian, written for some of the most prestigious publications in journalism, the New York Times, Washington Post, the New Yorker. But this is your first book. Have you always wanted to write one?
I have. When I was a little kid, I devoured every Sherman Alexie book that I could get my hands on. As I said, my mom is non-native and my dad's a somewhat notable native artist. And so I grew up a little bit confused, a child of 2 worlds, trying to sort out who I was and how I was going to make my way in the world as a native person, as a native man. And reading and writing was always central to that. I remember when I was 12 years old, I would write Sherman Alexie fan fiction where I imagined my own family on the Canham Lake res in the future. And I can't really remember whether in the future everybody had gotten skinny and remembered when we were a little bit more plump, or whether we'd all gotten big and remembered when we were skinnier. But the idea, the point is that writing and reading has always been something I loved and always been something that helped me sort through these questions that I have, that I think we all share maybe, about what it is to be Indigenous, what it is to be, a first person of this land. And, I always dreamt of writing a book. And so this, more so in a way than the film, has actually been the thing that I've always wanted to do in my life. And I just feel so grateful that it's here now.
Well, a huge congrats on that accomplishment. Julian, much more to talk about here. We just have to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Oscar-nominated filmmaker and author Julian Brave Noisecat, and we've been talking about Julian's latest novel, out now, first novel, never mind, We Survived the Night. Julian, you're going to be traveling across Canada and the United States to promote We Survived the Night with events. What types of conversations are you hoping to have?
Well, firstly, I take this coyote story thing pretty seriously, and there's actually a performance piece that I've developed. I call it an oral chapter because, of course, for the vast majority of their history, the coyote stories were a performance art. The coyote story would be told orally, and it would actually, in a sense, be performed by the person who was speaking the story. And so there's an oral chapter to We Survived the Night that the details of which, none of which are in the text at all, that I'm going to be performing while I'm performing on the road. And it's called Cover Story. So I'm really excited to share that. And I actually sing a song at the beginning, and I, get into the story of the cover of the book, and this kind of crazy connection to the artist John Quick to See Smith, who's one of the greatest painters in Indian country ever, and one of the greatest representatives of the trickster coyote. So I'm really excited to share that. And then, beyond that, I love connecting with Native readers and audiences. That has been one of the most beautiful things about having Sugarcane out in the world is to see how people see themselves in the work that I've helped create. And beyond that, I also look forward to talking to people about the universal parts of this story. This is a story about being Indigenous and about indigeneity, but it's also a story about fathers and sons, about parenting, about families, about the pain that we carry from the past. It's about tradition, which is not just something that Native people value, and it's about what is the best way to tell the story of our shared experiences on this land. And my humble suggestion is that Indigenous peoples have something essential to add to that conversation.
If you're wanting to check out where Julian's going to be, you can visit his website or Penguin Random House for the dates there. Lots of dates over the next few months. Of course, Julian, want to talk about Sugarcane. As I mentioned, I only got to see it for the first time this week. It's streaming now on Disney for those who haven't seen it. As we mentioned, also nominated for an Academy Award for Best Documentary. Is it still surreal to hear yourself referred to as Oscar-nominated filmmaker Julian Brave Noisecat?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, that one's definitely going to be in the obituary. Yeah. Not that I'm planning on heading that direction anytime soon, but I, as I was saying, my first love, my first dream was to become a writer. So to become a filmmaker was itself a turn of events that I hadn't necessarily planned for. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, to have your first film that you've ever made. I mean, like I literally hadn't made a TikTok before we made Sugarcane. And, to have the first film that you've ever made go all the way, as far as films can go, was completely surreal. And the part about it for me that was especially beautiful was to get to bring my dad along for the ride, and some members of my family as well, to see him on the red carpet in LA. I have this distinct memory of him with his like cowboy hat on with like Ariana Grande going in the back. And, to get to share, this big character who's been so fundamental to shaping who I am, my father, with the world, and for them to love and see him in all his beauty and complexity, also as a style icon, I'll just say, has been really special. And so it's it's been a stretch of not just like creativity and filmmaking, but life more broadly that I'm always going to be so grateful for.
I think the hope of any filmmaker is probably like, yeah, we're going to get nominated for an Oscar for this one, but you're also nominated for a Peabody Award. You won dozens of awards, including Best Documentary from the National Board of Review. Did you ever imagine that it would be met with so much acclaim or leave such a mark?
I mean, no, obviously nobody expects those kinds of things. But I would say that we always knew that this was a special story. I think that that's why we all committed ourselves, myself, my co-director Emily Cassie, our entire film team, to giving it everything that we had. We shot over 1,000 hours of footage to make Sugarcane. We were on the ground in Williams Lake for over 100 days. Like, we gave this thing everything we had. And, I think that we did that not necessarily because we thought we had like an Academy Award nominated potential film on our hands, but because we felt that this was a really special story. Firstly, that the Indian residential school story was one that we had to tell because it's one of the most foundational stories to all of North American history. Everybody needs to know about this. But also because, the people and the community that let us into their lives, my own family, the Williams Lake First Nation, the late Chief Rick Gilbert, Chief Willie Sellers, my Auntie Charlene Bellew, so many other people, even including ones who were not in the film, are just such beautiful, wonderful, generous people who were willing to support us in sharing their story, a very hard, painful, but ultimately I would say beautiful story. And, that was something that we knew we had, I would say, from the beginning.
Yeah, I won't give away anything, but the end there with Rick was a real gut punch for watchers. Yeah, just want the film's also a healing journey for you and your family. How did that all impact you?
Telling such a painful story is a scary thing. I'm not going to lie. It was the biggest thing that gave me pause. There's a real reason why my family, my grandmother in particular, doesn't talk about the Indian residential school experience. The things that she endured there, some of which I still do not know, were so painful that the way that she survived it was by, keeping it in, by not talking about it with anybody. And I have a lot of empathy for that. I had a lot of empathy for that from the beginning of the film, but especially after making it. I think that it's totally understandable that some of the members of our own families who were sent to the residential schools, who survived them, part of how they survived was by being silent, by suppressing it. And also, they ended up carrying, I think, in a lot of instances, a lot of shame and guilt and really complicated emotions because of this experience. And at the same time, I understood my dad's desire to know the story of his birth, to know the circumstances of his birth. So I feel a lot of responsibility to do both of those people. And I think the way that we ended up navigating that, in short, was with a lot of prayer, was with a lot of, ceremony and intention to make sure that at the same time as we knew we were telling a painful story, that we were doing it in a way that was with love and that had the greatest possibility of creating the potential for understanding and healing, firstly within the people in the film and in our own family, but then, beyond that as well as it went out into the world. And there was no way to fully know whether that would happen when Sugarcane went out into the world. And I am just so incredibly grateful, again, that is how the film was received, beginning with, my own family and community.
There's a moment in the film with Charlene Bellew, one of the investigators at St. Joseph's Residential School, herself a residential school survivor, former chief, Governor General Award recipient, and your auntie. But she says the elders are now looking to you to listen to their stories and says you're going to make sure people are held accountable. It's a powerful moment. Did you feel a lot of pressure telling this story?
A lot of pressure might be an understatement.
Yeah.
I think that part of what it is to be, indigenous, right, is to understand that there are responsibilities that we get handed down from those who've come before and in some instances gone on, that it's our responsibility to carry forward and then to pass on, to the next generation, whoever's coming behind us. And it is the honor of my life to, have helped extend Charlene Bellew, my auntie's legacy. She's been working on the investigations, on the efforts to, hold people accountable, to help our people heal from the residential schools for over 30 years now, way before there was talk of truth and reconciliation, way before this was, something that our own people were ready to do in many instances. And, I just am so grateful that she saw me as somebody who could help carry that forward. And, I hope that people who watch the film see that responsibility as one that we all share in some sense, whether we're Indigenous or not, right? This is a foundational story to Canada. This is a foundational story to North America. This is how they took the land. This is what they did to us and to our children. And, we all have a responsibility to remember and to ensure that something like this never happens again, and that the people who continue to be impacted by it, are loved and taken care of. And that, if that is part of your own family story, sometimes that means being willing to have hard conversations, and in other times it means being willing to know when people aren't going to be able to go past the conversations that they've had, and that has been all of that has been a really beautiful thing to be a part of, and yeah, I mean, what an honor, right?
Yeah, she's quite a warrior among many in the story. Julian, we need to step aside for one last quick break here, and then we'll continue the conversation. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is filmmaker, journalist, and author Julian Brave Noisecat. Julian, we've been talking about the award-winning, Oscar-nominated documentary Sugarcane. Any plans to do a follow-up documentary on St. Joseph's Residential School?
No follow-up documentary on the school itself, but I actually already have my next documentary started a little bit. We're trying to get it funded. We have a whole pitch deck and all that sort of stuff. It's not about residential schools at all. I guess I got to be careful what I say, because my producers tell me that I'm not supposed to reveal too much about it yet because it's not public. But what I will say is that it's kind of about a different, very important and consequential part of Indigenous history, the part of our history wherein we started to reclaim our rights, our self-determination, a turning point towards the contemporary resurgence of our people. That's essentially what the next documentary is going to be about. So the last one was about the thing that almost killed off our people and our culture. The next one's about how we came back.
Well, super looking forward to whatever it is and whenever you're able to lay out the details, but I'm sure you're going to be pretty tied up for the next little bit out there promoting the book. So congrats on the book and on all the acclaim that you've had over the many years here, Julian. Appreciate you taking some time for us this week.
I really appreciate getting to be on APTN. This is always playing in my cat's house and in the houses on the Cannon Lake Res, so this is a real special one for me.
Awesome stuff. That is all the time we have for Face to Face this week. You can catch up on any episodes you may have missed by visiting our website, aptnnews.ca, or our APTN News page on YouTube. All of our Face to Face episodes are also available as podcasts, including this one. You can find those wherever you choose to download audio from. I'm Dennis Ward. Marcy Miigwech, thanks for being with us. We'll see you back here in 7 days.